There's a ticking somewhere underneath your everyday life, not a real sound, something quieter, and somehow harder to ignore. You didn't wind it up. You can't point to the moment it started, but you feel it most in the silence late at night, on a slow Sunday, in any stretch of time that isn't packed tight enough to drown it out. And its message never really changes. You're behind. Everyone else seems to be further along. The version of your life that was supposed to exist by now doesn't. That feeling doesn't stay in your thoughts. It settles physically, a tightness somewhere between your ribs and your stomach, a low static of urgency that turns even peaceful days into something to survive rather than enjoy. Rest starts to feel like a risk you can't afford. Stillness starts to feel like falling further behind. What's strange is that this feeling rarely visits people who are actually sitting still. It shows up in people who are working hard, building things, checking boxes, and still feel like they're losing to a race no one else even knows exists. So the issue was never a lack of drive. The issue is that achievement doesn't switch the clock off. You hit one marker, and it simply resets to the next one. You're never permitted to just be where you currently are. And maybe the most draining part is that some part of you already knows this doesn't fully make sense. You know no one issued you an official schedule for your life. You know comparing yourself to others is a losing game. You know the pace of a meaningful life isn't standardized across every person on Earth. But knowing all of this doesn't stop the ticking. It just adds a second layer of fatigue. Now you're not only racing an invisible deadline, you're also aware the deadline may be imaginary, and you still can't make yourself stop running. So let's actually trace where this feeling comes from, because psychology has quietly been mapping it for decades. Developmental psychologist Daniel Levinson coined a term for it, the social clock. It's the internalized, largely unconscious set of expectations about when things in life are supposed to happen. School finished by a certain age, career established by a certain point, relationships and milestones arriving inside culturally approved windows. Levinson's research found that nobody builds this timeline on their own. It's absorbed from parents, from culture, from the people you grew up around, from the media that shaped your idea of normal. Once it's in place, it becomes a running background calculation. Where am I, compared to where the clock insists I should be? Here's the part that matters most from his findings. That clock was never measuring your actual readiness or well-being. It was measuring conformity to a statistical average pulled from one particular culture, at one particular moment in history, built on one narrow definition of a successful life. It isn't a universal law. It's closer to an inherited assumption that got mistaken for a fact. But it doesn't feel like an assumption. It feels like the truth. And falling short of it feels like personal failure instead of what it actually is, which is a mismatch between your one specific life and someone else's statistical average. Stanford psychologist Laura Carstensen has spent much of her career studying how people relate to time, work that became known as socio-emotional selectivity theory. One of her central findings is this: the sense that time is running out isn't primarily about your actual chronological age. It's about your perceived horizon, your internal read on how much meaningful time you have left, whether or not that read is accurate. And that perceived horizon quietly reshapes what you pay attention to, what you value, and how urgently every day feels. Which means the racing feeling underneath your life may have very little to do with the calendar. It may trace back to a horizon that got compressed by something earlier, an experience that taught you the future can't fully be trusted. Grow up somewhere unstable, and your nervous system may learn early that plans don't always hold, that the ground can shift without warning. That kind of imprint doesn't fade just because you got older. It leaves behind a prediction system that treats the future with less confidence than it treats the past. Researchers studying trauma and time perception have found a consistent pattern. People carrying real early adversity often experience a shortened sense of the future. Harder to picture clearly, harder to trust. Not because their future is objectively any shorter, but because a nervous system shaped by instability assigns less weight to anything far off. So the urgency you feel might not be ambition at all. It might be an old survival reflex, grabbing for things before they can vanish, just working off outdated information. There's a second version of this urgency, and it comes from somewhere different: the slow accumulation of unlived life. Years where you technically showed up but weren't fully present in them, where you managed your days instead of actually living them, where you kept the things you truly wanted on layaway for some more convenient future. A future that, once it finally arrived, felt strangely underwhelming. This isn't fear of scarcity. It's the discomfort of debt, the debt of a self that's been waiting in the wings for a someday that keeps quietly slipping past. Here's a more hopeful thread, though. Existential psychologist Irvin Yalom studied people who had confronted mortality head-on through serious illness, through losing someone close. He documented what he called the awakening experience. Contrary to expectation, facing the reality of limited time didn't push these people deeper into panic. It did the reverse. It made them more present. Confronting real limitation didn't paralyze them. It freed them from the habit of endlessly postponing their own lives. Yalom called this the gift of desperation. The awareness that time is finite isn't the enemy of a well-lived life. Handled consciously, it's actually the thing that makes presence possible. The clock was never the real problem. Your relationship to it is. And this is where the true cost shows up, in what constant future focus does to the present. When you're perpetually calculating whether you're on track, the present stops being a place you live in and becomes a corridor you're rushing through towards some future room where real life supposedly starts. But that room keeps relocating. The requirements keep shifting. So the present never actually gets lived, only managed, endured, deferred in favor of a future that never quite shows up on schedule. Mindfulness researcher John Kabat-Zinn calls this state automatic pilot, the mode where most waking hours get spent planning, reviewing, and anticipating, instead of being in real contact with the moment currently happening. His research points to something worth sitting with. The quality of a life isn't determined by its outcomes. It's determined by how present you actually were while it unfolded. So what actually shifts this pattern? Start by naming the exact clock, not the vague sense of behind, but the precise milestone driving it. Then ask honestly, is this something I actually want? For my own reasons? Or is it absorbed from family, culture, comparison, and never really chosen? That single distinction changes everything. Gen U in goals deserve real energy. Borrowed deadlines deserve real scrutiny before you keep sprinting toward them. Next, practice what Carstensen calls prioritizing the present, not as a trick to reduce anxiety, but as an honest recalibration of what's actually real. The future you're chasing isn't more real than the life you're currently living. It's less real. It hasn't happened yet, and the odds it unfolds exactly as imagined are slim. The present is the only moment actually occurring. You already know how to be fully in it. You felt it in moments of real connection or absorption. The work is simply letting that capacity stay online longer than the urgency wants to allow. Finally, let the urgency speak without letting it drive. When it rises, acknowledge it plainly. Yes, time is limited. Hui we. There are things I want that haven't arrived yet. Then ask one specific question. What could I do today that moves me toward the life I actually want? Instead of the life I feel behind on, not a grand gesture. One real, present tense action. The urgency isn't wrong to exist. It's simply aimed at the wrong target at the gap itself, rather than at the single step that closes it. The clock was never really yours. The deadline was never objective. The distance between where you are and where you think you should be was measured against a standard built for somebody else's life entirely. You're not behind, you're here. And here isn't a waiting room. It's the only place your life has ever actually been happening.